Hello, good morning. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Got a great session lined up for you today. If you can do me a quick favour before we start and get into the main content, just let us know you're here, send us a quick message, let us know where you're joining us from. Always nice to see people, where you're from and where you're tuning in from today. If you've got any questions at any point during today's session, just submit them into the little questions box, and then there'll be a bit of time at the end of the webinar to answer those, or as many of those as we can. And also, do us a favour, if you tag us on social media, so if you want to tweet us and tag us or mention us on LinkedIn, we'll pick one or two people at random and just let you be in the pot for a chance of winning some Crowd Control HQ swag. So we've got some stickers and some pens and things like that. So yeah, give us a tag and we'll see if we can get some bits and pieces out to you. So joining from very sunny St Albans, thanks Claire, looking forward to the webinar. Hello from sunny but cold Torquay. No worries, Joe, it can't be warm everywhere. It's quite kind of nice and clear and blue skies today here in Birmingham, but again, it's a bit chilly, so probably similar to you. Joining from the sunny northeast, thanks Hannah, good to have you on board. So thanks everyone, I hope you can see the slides okay, and it seems like you can hear us loud and clear. Becca, joining from a windy and cold Cardiff, good to have you on. Ruth, hello from North Shields, hello Ruth. So thanks everyone for joining. We're going to get stuck in, but we're going to talk about how to connect social media strategy with brand objectives. So it's a really interesting topic. I think something that many organisations have probably thought about or questioned, or looking for sort of tips and tricks on how they can connect social media and brand a little bit better. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So my name is Dan Aston. I'm Marketing Manager at Crowd Control HQ. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker today is Dawn McGuigan. Hi Dawn, you there?
Hello, hi Dan.
Hey Dawn. So Dawn's going to be talking through some really interesting insights and sort of advice, I think, and maybe a couple of stories from previous work that Dawn's been doing around how to actually make that connection between your social media strategy and your brand objectives. So Dawn, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the introduction, Dan, and welcome to everybody that's listening. Nice to hear that there's some people in the northeast representing today. I can concur that it is sunny, but it's absolutely freezing. So the webinar today is looking at how to connect social media strategy with brand objectives. It's all about aligning what you do on social media with how you can support your wider brand objectives and ultimately your overall business aims. The presentation draws on my experience of overseeing social media channels for large public sector organisations over the last 5 years. So that includes a social housing organisation and a local authority. And I also wrote my final assignment for my CIPR professional diploma at the end of last year on this topic. So I'm hoping to give you a mix of the theory and planning models behind this, as well as some practical tips. And what I did realise when I was writing this up actually is how big this subject is. So I certainly don't think I'm going to cover everything in the half an hour that I've got, but hopefully it gives you some inspiration for where to start and maybe where to go next with your strategic social media planning. So I thought it would be useful to really start with the common challenges that we all face. So if you are currently managing social media channels for an organisation or have done that to any extent in the past, you'll know how difficult a task that is. I think it's often, people often underestimate the effort that goes into managing social media accounts. So give yourself a pat on the back if you're doing that. So in terms of the common challenges that we all face, firstly, I think that many of us fall into the trap of only broadcasting our own content on social media. It's usually content that we've designed for other platforms and audiences. So a press release, for example, that we are writing for journalists to be published on news channels. So that content might not be specifically designed for social media, and therefore it doesn't often perform as we'd like it to. I'm sure many of you will have had a tirade of negative comments on a press release that you've put out on social media because it's not quite hitting that mark, and people are seeing it as a red flag in terms of giving you some of the more negative feedback that they might have about your organisation. You might also have too much or too little content. So if you work in a large organisation, I found this very much when I was working in a local authority, you get demands from all across the business to share content at the same time, and that content can create a lot of noise and kind of results in a lack of focus on your channel. So it's quite difficult for your audience to find what you're really about, or what's really going on in your community. On the other hand, you might have too little content. You might only have your kind of day-to-day operational content, which your audience might find dull and frankly believes you should be doing anyway, so why are you bragging about it on social media? And you might find that you don't have a forward plan for social media. So that might be because you don't have any kind of clear organizational marketing or communication strategy or wider kind of business objectives, which means that your content planning becomes ad hoc and reactionary. So hopefully that's not too distant to kind of some of your experiences of managing social media channels. So the typical content that we might be putting out on social media at the moment is listed here. So these are the types of things that you might be sharing regularly when you work for a large organisation, particularly in the public sector. Some of it, like job vacancies that are listed there, you will have high engagement on those because people will tag their friends and family that are looking for work. Other pieces of content will attract high engagement, but with a negative sentiment. So the press releases that I mentioned earlier, for example, followers might hijack press releases or some of your operational updates to tell you what you're not doing so well, or tell you a negative experience that they've had with your organisation. So there's nothing wrong with this type of content per se, and it is stuff that we have to get out there. But how can we kind of look at it differently so that it starts to contribute to delivering our overall brand objectives? So I think it's important to start looking at kind of where we sit in the hierarchy of objectives within our organisation. This triangle example is from PR Smith, and I think it's one of the clearest I've seen in terms of illustrating the flow and structure of objectives and strategies within an organisation. All organisations should start with a mission that outlines what they aim to do, and hopefully your organisations have got a vision or a mission statement outlining that. Under that sit the corporate objectives and strategies that fulfil those objectives and ultimately the mission that you're trying to achieve. Marketing communications objectives and the strategies that deliver on those should be formed in response to those overarching corporate objectives and strategies. This is an issue that I'm really, really passionate about, because I think us as marketing communications professionals, if we're not aiming to support the overall goals of our organisation, then what is our role all about? What are we trying to do? But that's a massive subject and probably a separate webinar all in itself. But finally, you can see on the bottom of the pyramid that they are the marketing communications programs that we deliver to support those strategies, and they are the largest because they are the tactical plans that we deliver on a day-to-day basis. So you can start to see kind of where marketing communications and the plans and activity that we deliver fit in the organisational hierarchy of objectives. When we start looking in more detail at marketing communications objectives, I found these two books really useful when completing my CIPR diploma last year. So the Share This and the sequel Share This Too. So these focus on how PR practitioners can use social media strategically, and they have some fantastic kind of practical guidance on doing that. Every chapter is written by practitioners, so they are really, really useful. And one chapter that I found really helpful and that really changed my perspective on how we use social media was this one from Robin Wilson, and it's called Content Frameworks, Using Content to Achieve Marketing Communications Goals. And it's in Share This Too, which is the silver book. So we'll look now at some of the things that he advocates in that chapter that can really help kind of reframe your social media activity and align it much more closely to your brand objectives. So Wilson's content frameworks, this is a quote from this chapter that I think is really useful. So he says, in terms of engaging audiences and driving business goals, creating a compelling content strategy is perhaps one of the most critical factors facing businesses today. So this clearly makes the case for the significance of content in engaging our audiences and ultimately driving the business goals of our organisations. So again, the point I made earlier, that often I think social media is viewed as possibly a trivial communications medium, because it's viewed as a bit more fun and a bit more engaging, but actually it plays a massive part in delivering on those business goals that we're all aiming to achieve. So when we plan content for social media, we need to ask ourselves 2 questions. The first one is, what marketing communications objectives do we want to affect? So thinking back to our hierarchy of objectives, how is the piece of content we're developing going to contribute to that overall marketing communication strategy, which then ultimately supports our overall business aims and goals? The second question is, what reactions or actions do we want to generate from a piece of content? So we can produce a range of great content, really, really creative stuff, but if it doesn't have a purpose, then what's the point of doing that? We need to think about what we want our audience to do as a result of watching or reading the content that we create and then share on social media. One of the really handy things in Wilson's chapter in that book is this content planning grid, which I found a really straightforward tool for starting to be more strategic in thinking about how social media content is going to be used. So this grid helps us to answer those questions that we've just looked at and to really create content with purpose. So on the first column is identifying our marketing communications objectives. So those are the strategic aims that we're trying to fulfill as professional communicators. So they could be things like increasing brand recognition and brand loyalty. It could be educating our followers, informing them about a particular issue, or it could be something as fairly straightforward as sales. Obviously, if you're working in the public sector, you might not have direct sales, but it might be trying to sign people up to an event or get them to participate in a particular campaign that you are running. The grid also identifies content objectives, so you can see what each piece of content is trying to achieve. So that could be anything from awareness, engagement, or specific leads or inquiries we want a call to action that we want people to follow up on. And finally, it states how we'll measure whether the content was successful by identifying the metrics we'll use to monitor the performance. So these KPIs will not be new to anybody who's looking at social media at the moment. It is your views, your shares, your comments, your retweets, but it's really understanding from the start, when we're developing a piece of content, what is it that we want to see as a result of that content? So which of those KPIs are we going to use as a specific measure of the performance of that individual piece of content? Wilson argues in this chapter that really effective social media channels offer a combination of the 3 C's of content. Created content is obviously the stuff that you are producing yourself in-house or with an agency. Curated content is the content that you gather from other organisations that you can share on your channels. It's really important with curated content that you are looking at organisations that share your brand values, and you are not sharing content from organisations that go against the mission, vision and values that you have as an organisation. And commissioned content, so this can be paid for content that you're asking other people to produce on your behalf, and it can also be content that results from building relationships with and supplying content to bloggers, influencers, journalists who then go away and produce their own content on their own channels that you can share on yours. So those 3 C's really give you a kind of a variety of content that you can start to publish within your social media channels.
Hi Dawn, I've got a quick question. So what do you think the ratios could roughly be for the 3 C's? Is it an equal split, or is it more heavily weighted towards created and then with a little bit less curated, a little bit less commissioned, something like that?
I think it will depend on the type of organisation that you are, because again, looking at the public sector example, there might be some restrictions there in terms of promoting private businesses or aligning yourself with certain organisations. So there might be some restrictions there, so you therefore may have less commissioned content than a private business might have.
Yeah.
But sorry?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry, yeah. But I think, yeah, the ultimate aim is to try and get that balance, but to make that kind of reasonable for the type of organisation that you're working for. Okay, so moving on, this is where we start to see the shift in how we frame our social media content and how we start to look at kind of producing it. This is another quote from Wilson, and he says that acting like a media company and producing content that people want to read, watch, or listen is very different to producing content you want people to read. So thinking back to the earlier slide where we listed the typical type of content that you might be publishing on social media, at the moment, that's very much the content that you want people to read. It's information about your brand, about your organisation that you want people to know. But unfortunately, with the best will in the world, that's not always the information that people want to consume or want to engage with or want to read and listen to. So we need to start thinking as a media company and producing content that we know our audience is going to like and engage with. And this is really important because you'll all be aware about kind of algorithms and how social media works. And the more engagement we have on a piece of content, the higher up the news feeds it will appear. So the more people are going to see that content. So if we can produce more stuff that's more engaging, then the reach of our content overall becomes much broader. So when you do have to get branded messages out there or really important information to your customers or your residents or your tenants, it's much more likely that they're going to see that because overall your social media content is performing much better. So there is a kind of a longer term strategy around this too in terms of the visibility of your brand content. So looking at the kind of mix of content that we can produce under that frame of a much more kind of media organisation, and this kind of content goes further than the list of brand and operational content that we looked at earlier, although that obviously still remains important and we still need to push that out. But this is about publishing and sharing content that will interest and engage our audiences. So you can see from this list, there's topics of interest, there's really specific engagement tactics like quizzes and polls, useful facts, information that people want to consume, want to hear, listen to, and engage with. So in terms of planning this, how do we start looking at how we can make this part of our social media strategy? So this is a content matrix that that Wilson has developed, and again, I find this a really useful tool to just start to see how your social media activities is going to be planned out. So it identifies the content type. So that could be a branded piece of content, it could be about a product, event, a topic of interest, an engagement tactic, or a useful fact. It identifies those content objectives. So again, thinking about what is it that we are trying to achieve through this piece of content. And then it looks at content KPIs. So thinking from the very start, how are we going to measure that this has actually had the impact that we wanted it to? You can then start to plot on this matrix when you will be delivering this content. So this one just shows a very small kind of 7-day view, but you can start to see where you plot when you're going to deliver that content, that your feeds become a much more diverse feed of a variety of content that's much more likely to engage your audiences on the topics that they're interested in. So you have a plan of what you want to do, but how can you start looking at how can you find out basically what your audience is interested in? And one of the ways is to use Facebook Insights. So if you're managing formal kind of official Facebook pages, you're more than likely now onto Facebook Business Manager, which is an absolute treasure trove of information about your audiences. And this was something that I picked up on a training course last year with Helen Reynolds, who runs the Comms Creative and has worked with crowd control quite a lot and has some great content on the website. And these are some tips that she gave me at that training course around how can we kind of mine the business manager pages for data about an audience. I'm not currently managing a Facebook page at the minute, so this is just a generic example. So if you go into your own accounts, you will find much more detail, but this is just to give you an indication of where you can find this information. So you can see on the column on the left where I've put the red square around it, there is a specific box on interest there, so you can actually search on any interest that you would like, and you can see how many of your followers are also interested in that issue. And under your audience page, if you click on page likes, it will give you a list of the types of pages that your followers are also following. So you can start to see the types of issues that they are interested in and interested in consuming and engaging with on Facebook. So you can see that it's kind of food and drink, coffee shops, shopping, and then it would list the specific pages against that. So you can start to see there might be some communities in your local area, a particular cafe that everybody's following or engaging with. But you can start to build up a profile of what your followers are interested in beyond your organisation. When I've done this in the past with organisations that I've worked for, there's always been 3 key themes that have come out in this exercise, and these are, interestingly, dogs. Everybody loves dogs. Whether it's posts on like Dogs Trust doing the chipping events, whether it's memes on dogs doing cute things, just dogs in general seem to be a massive source of interest for the public. Food in particular, you can see on this example behind that food is at the top, but especially pizza seems to be something that people absolutely love. So when I've done this for kind of real life organisations, we've found that pizza delivery places or pizza restaurants in the local area were really high up, and lots of people were following their pages. And the third one is kind of local area information. So people have a lot of pride in where they live. So they're interested in nostalgic content, they're interested about useful facts and information about living in their area, and they absolutely love lovely photographs of things that are happening in and around the communities that they live in. So the next step is we've looked at this, we've kind of mined this this source of information to better understand our audience. So how can we start to use that as content on our social media channels? These are some examples of how I've done that. One example was a poll on, does pineapple belong on a pizza? The answer is no, by the way, definitely not. We put that out. Well, this is the point. We put that out, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, and got an absolutely massive response, with people having that very same argument between themselves in a very nice way, obviously. But we got lots of engagement in it, and it was all positive. So again, thinking back about those algorithms, that positive engagement and the number of shares, likes and comments that we were receiving all contributes to more people seeing our content. We did something on the T strength grid. You might have seen this several times on social media, but again, something fairly straightforward that people can comment on, and you start to get the kind of the gentle arguments between each other about which tea or coffee is actually, the best. So they might seem like fairly glib, and trivial issues, and they are, but they do generate that positive engagement, which helps us push through the algorithms and raise the kind of profile of our feed overall. Another example is a photography competition. So I've done this with several organisations that I've worked for, and this example I'm showing now is from North Tyneside Council. So we put something out there asking for people to send us pictures from their local area for a chance to win a prize, and we got about 100 photographs in the first couple of days. It was really, really popular with local people. We were a seaside town, the area that we focused on in particular was Whitley Bay, so it was very picturesque, but people responded really, really well to it. So it started off as a social media project that we were trying to create some kind of positive sentiment about that town, but because of the level of engagement we got with it, we managed to actually leverage that and use it on other channels as well. So this spiraled into some press coverage, so we released some of the images to the media. We got a double page spread in the biggest newspaper in our area. We created a calendar from it, which is the picture that you can see on the screen now, the proceeds from which went towards the Mayor's charity, and the artwork was put on hoardings on a major regeneration project. So you can start to see how creating user-generated content, commissioning these kind of ideas from your followers can lead to much broader marketing communications activities that support your brand objectives than just simply a Facebook post. Hopefully this gives you a kind of flavour of how you can take that research about your followers and apply it to a kind of a formal plan of how you want your social media content to support your brand objectives, and then can look at other opportunities for that, supporting your wider activity as well. So I think in terms of, just to round up my top tips on connecting your social media strategy with business objectives, I think firstly is to understand your objectives. So be clear on what your organisation is trying to achieve and how your marketing communications activities support those. So you might have a 3 or a 5 year business plan, you might have a corporate plan. There should be something that outlines exactly what your businesses are trying to achieve, and make sure you understand that and how you fit into that picture. Know your audience. So do some research and further digging to understand what interests your audience, so you can tailor your content around those targeted issues. And as we've seen, there's a whole range of information out there. You just have to spend some time kind of really digging into it. And be creative. I think don't be scared to try something different or something new, and never think that something is too trivial to contribute to this form of kind of strategic planning. It can take time to convince senior leaders that posts about pizza are supporting your brand if you're not a pizza retailer or a pizza takeaway. But if you explain the strategy behind it in terms of that content is engaging with our audiences and increasing the reach of our product, then they should hopefully start to see the results and come round to this different kind of strategic approach to social media.
Brilliant.
And that is everything I've got to cover today.
No, that's wonderful. It's just super interesting, and I like the way that you summarised the tips here at the end, just to understand the objectives, know your audience, and be creative. And I know on that last one, which is, as you mentioned, sometimes be creative, you might feel like you don't have the permission to be creative, but yeah, I think you can maybe start with just 1 or 2 things, and then use those to show that actually, if we can be a little bit creative, we give ourselves permission to be a little bit more creative, we get some different results or different different outcomes, which then link back to the grids that you showed earlier around what is the most important outcome that you're trying to measure. Is it click-throughs and sign-ups, or is it just views and shares and comments, or something else? Yeah, super interesting. So I've got a quick question for you, Dawn, but anyone in the audience today, if you want to submit a question using the little questions box, please do so. And then we've got a bit of time now to cover some questions, so we can have a chat around those. But I think, so for you, Dawn, like how did your sort of social media audience or the relationships that you had on social media change as a result of this focus onto, not only just broadcasting, but thinking about posting things that might be a bit more interesting and relevant? Was there, so when you think about brand objectives, one thing is sort of like building trust, and then the other is around increasing sort of engagement. So if you do have to ask for feedback or sign-ups or input on something that the organization is doing, those kind of things, obviously you're trying to influence and change behavior a little bit. So how did that look?
I think the biggest change that I saw was that we started to increase the number of brand advocates that we had on social media. So particularly when I was at North Tyneside Council, we were going through quite a challenging period where we had some major regeneration works going on that were controversial. We had a significant programme of roadwork improvements which caused lots of traffic delays, and we were just implementing fortnightly bin collections, which, if anybody has experienced that, it is quite a challenging task. So Facebook in particular was a very negative place for us, and people would hijack anything that we did and really start to get at us and complain about us. So a lot of our time was spent responding to those queries or complaints. But as we started to change the content that we put out there and put much more engaging stuff on, and the kind of sentiment started to change towards us, we found that those advocates that we were creating through that type of content would then jump on the feeds of the other posts that were more negative and actually defend us, or start to challenge some of the negative commenters on there. So over time we saw that the approach to engaging more with our audience meant that we created more ambassadors who would support us kind of when we needed them to. So I think that was the
amazing.
biggest result that we saw as a result of it. But it certainly didn't happen overnight. This is a kind of a long-term approach, and you will have to bide your time and see how this works for your organisation. But I think that was definitely the most significant change that I witnessed.
Yeah, and it's quite a significant change, and I can appreciate it doesn't happen over time, but then it's almost like you've got a bigger team when you've got advocates out there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Actually supporting you, pointing people in the right
saves
direction.
you the job as well. You don't have to always go back to people because somebody's doing it on your behalf.
Yeah, fantastic. No, you can see how that'd be really, really valuable. So, yeah, we have got a few questions. So I'm just going to quickly whiz through, and then we can take a look. So, question from Ruth. You mentioned the importance of forward planning. How far in advance do you tend to plan? I'd love to invest more time to planning, but other work always seems to get in the way.
Yeah, it's the same old problem, isn't it, with anything? I think that it's the holy grail to have a long-term forward plan, but it doesn't always work like that. And to some extent, you can't always plan everything because operational issues and things like that come along unannounced, or you might have a crisis to manage. But I think probably looking at kind of 3-month chunks if you can, at least looking, if you're taking this approach of looking at the content that's going to engage with your audiences, I think you can look longer term. So if you do a 3-month plan around, right, we're going to do these posts at this time every week, for example, like the pizza one, we might do that every Friday afternoon, and we'll do that for 3 months, and we'll plan the type of content that we're going to put out there, and we can get prepared with a video or an infographic or an image. The other content, the more branded stuff in terms of what your organization's doing, the operational stuff, can be more difficult to plan, but that's when you need to align it with your wider kind of marketing communications plans and strategies. So you probably have a broad idea of the big things that are coming up for your organization over the next few months, when they're going to happen. Obviously there's a risk as ever that they might move and need to be changed, but I think having a kind of a broad 12-month plan of what's happening in your organization, but then a kind of a specific 3-month plan, so kind of a quarterly plan of action in terms of what you're actually going to deliver on social media usually works well for me.
Okay, no, that makes sense, and especially obviously because I just love the engaging, the pizza poll and then the T strength grid and things like that. So are you just creating a calendar for social media to say every Friday, and these are the questions we're going to ask each Friday?
Yeah, when we tried this at my last organisation, we did a trial for 3 months. So we were basically putting stuff out at different times of the week, in different formats, and we were monitoring that and looking at what worked best for us. There's nothing worse than putting a tumbleweed post out where nobody engages in it at all because you've picked the wrong time because everybody's doing the school run or whatever it might be. So there is a bit of trial and error in testing some of this. So I think give yourself some time to really test what works with your audiences in terms of the type of content they respond to. Do they prefer videos, or do they respond better to photographs or infographics? See what works for them, see what times you get the best engagement, and then start to use that to help your plans as well. And really, like I said, be creative and don't be scared to try it. If it doesn't work one week, try it a different way the next week, and over time you'll start to build a picture of what does work, and then that can help you kind of really hone in on those plans in more detail.
Brilliant. So test it basically,
yeah.
to see what works for you. Makes sense. Okay, so question from Joe. So she's put that they're looking at trialing 3 weekly bin collections. So any tips greatly received. So I guess that's collecting every 3 weeks rather than 3 times a week. But
firstly, you have my every sympathy. It is such a challenging one now. It really, really is. We found that personalising it a little bit more helped us. So when we first started, it was the big bad council are doing this to us and aren't they horrible, and they're cutting all of our services and not coming to collect our bins. So we started to put the refuse collectors front and centre. So if you've got people that are happy to be filmed or to be photographed doing their jobs, then try and work with them. So if you've got, I don't know, Dave who comes and collects your bins talking about something on camera about the importance of why you're doing this and the reasons behind it, can be much more effective than your cabinet member for environment telling somebody that. So yeah, we really tried to make it a bit more personal. Still trying to, include in all of those bigger messages about the environment and costs and things about why we'd taken this decision and why it was happening, but having that delivered by kind of real people as opposed to politicians or senior officers seemed to make it a bit more personal, and people seem to be less angry or less willing to be nasty to those people, because they were their peers as opposed to, senior people talking down at them. So that seemed to work well for us. But it just takes one missed collection or somebody forgets to put the bin out and it can all, go back to square one again. So it's definitely a long-term approach. So hope it goes well. Good luck.
Yeah, good advice. So another question. Hi there, it's Jade from Onward Homes. Hi Jade, good to have you with us. Just wondering if you have any top tips on getting internal social media ambassadors on board. So yeah, we've got any experience with that. I guess, yeah, the internal stakeholders, internal ambassadors.
I think, as I said earlier, it can be quite difficult to convince senior leaders that something like this approach is valid and is professional. So I think if you know that there's kind of senior leaders within your organisation that really get this, then use them and harness them as much as you possibly can. But also, we did a few examples before kind of going to people with this information, because it can be quite conceptual and big when you first start talking about this, and if you're not used to these marketing communications terminology and brand objectives and all of that kind of thing, it can sound quite strange and just pie in the sky. So we did a few examples and then showed the difference between the engagement rates on those compared to an average post that we'd done. And once we could show the evidence of that, then we could start to get the backing of people to really allow us to have the freedom to develop that further. So I think in terms of the internal social media ambassadors, make sure you're sharing some of this internally with all of your staff, whatever platform you use, whether it's an intranet or you're using Workplace or whatever it might be. Share some of the information with your staff so they're aware of what you're doing. So when they see it externally, if they're following your external social media accounts, they can share that as well and be supportive. And really try to get your senior leaders on board, I think, by showing them the examples, show them the evidence that this is working for you, and then it's contributing to that kind of bigger picture.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you can't argue if you've got the stats to show that we did this and we've got better outcomes as a result. Like, exactly. You can't really argue with that. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. So yeah, another question this one's from Joe. How much time do you feel needs to be given to engaging with your followers every day or every week?
Oh, that's a difficult one to answer, because I think it depends on well, firstly, it depends on the resource that you've got. I've been lucky enough in the past to have a dedicated social media manager. So it's their full-time job to do this. So you can obviously dedicate much more time if that's the thing that you're doing day in, day out. It can be much more difficult if social media is a little part of everybody's job. So you've only got time to dip in and out of it every day. So it can be quite a challenge. But I think it really depends on your individual organisation. So how big a channel is social media for you in your whole kind of marketing and PR mix? That could, if it's a huge channel for you, then you need to dedicate a lot of time to it. And it depends on what stage you're at, I suppose, of using social media. I know some organisations are still, very early on and need to build communities, so you might want to spend more time on those while you build up your community to a certain level. Others that have more established communities, and if you're lucky enough to have some ambassadors, tend to look after themselves a little bit more. So I think it really depends on the size of your team, the team that's managing your social media accounts, the size of social media in the grand scheme of your marketing and communications mix, and the stage that you're at in development and what you're trying to do with your social media accounts. So I know that's a bit of a woolly answer. It hasn't really answered your question, but I think it's quite a difficult one, because it really depends on what what's available to you and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's one of those where the answer is it depends based on the circumstances, and also what your level of maturity, I guess, with the thing in social media, like embedded and everyone's using it, or you've only got one person in the organisation using it, and those kind of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, got another question. From Yvonne. I want to ask about GovComms and dealing with the hate when it comes to diff comms. So I guess it's about, and it's always a tricky topic, but like how to respond to negative posts and negative comments. If that's something that is that anyone's specifically interested in, we have got some content around that with some tips and advice on how to do it. Should you respond every time? Should you just delete them? The answer is no, but it's always a question that comes up. So yeah, I don't know, like a few thoughts on that, Dawn?
Yeah, I think if somebody's saying something that is blatantly wrong and factually incorrect, then I would always correct them. And ideally, if you can link them to a page on your website that has full information about the scheme that they're criticising or something like that, that really helps. But yeah, I wouldn't allow misinformation or fake news to infiltrate your feed. So I would always call that out. And like you say, I wouldn't delete those comments, because I think it's really important that your other followers see that you're intervening in that. So that supports your kind of your brand values and things like that, about being supportive and ethical and all of those kind of things. If you're seen to be challenging that bad information, then that can really work for you. It becomes a bit more difficult when it's people's opinions, and they often get quite nasty or offensive in some ways. If something is blatantly offensive, racist, sexist, anything like that, then I would challenge that definitely and delete it and refer to your community rules. I'm assuming you have some rules in terms of, if you engage on here, these are the things you need to comply with, and these are the things that will moderate and will not. But again, sometimes if you're lucky enough to have advocates, people will challenge those conversations as well, and it's often a good idea to let that play out, because it will resolve itself. And that doesn't always happen. Obviously, you have to have the right people in the right place, kind of talking to those people. But that can often be the best result if you can kind of nurture that over time. But yeah, I would definitely call out any misinformation and just kind of share the facts. I wouldn't tolerate anything that is blatantly offensive, and always kind of refer to your guidelines of using that community so that people are aware of that. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and to your point, I think you're right. If you've got in your social media guidelines or house rules, or however you describe it, and someone is swearing, then you are actually able to delete that if it's on Facebook. That's one of the exceptions. But if it's just a negative comment, don't delete, just respond. And it just comes back around full circle. I think if you can build those advocates by getting social media linked to your brand objectives, then the advocates are going to be there to support you, so you're not on your own with it. So it kind of makes a lot of sense. I think I'm just going to check. I think there might be one or two more questions, so I think we can just take a quick look at those really quick. Question from Hannah: is there an ideal number of posts you would suggest a week?
Again, I think this is it depends on your feeds, your audience, the stage of your social media channels. If you're very early on, I would try not to kind of bombard your audience with lots and lots of content, because you don't want to create your own noise that you then have to fight through. But you might find that you have specific times of day that work really well for you. So you might have a lunchtime might work well, because people are logging on during their lunch break to social media, and you find that you get more engagement on things then. It might be after work, when people are at home. There could be a range of different things. So I think it depends on your organisation, but really testing and monitoring what works for you will help you to kind of determine what the ideal number of posts are for you and when to post them. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that, but it's really just testing your channels and seeing what works for you, and then kind of building that into your more formal planning structure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I would maybe just add to that, some of your social media accounts will be set up intentionally to do the sort of posting activity, you know, like promoting content and engaging with your audiences. But you might have some which are more reactive. You know, they're set up to be reactive. So you might have a specific Twitter account for you know, inquiries or, you know, customer service and things like that, which would be handled in a different way. So not much posting, but, you know, it's more around like how do you resource that to respond and things.
Yeah.
Things like that. Okay, great. I think just one more question, and it's could be a tricky one. I don't know. Interesting question from Joe. If the top interests conflict with your business objectives and or content strategy, how would you still give the people what they want versus what's appropriate for your brand?
Good question. Yeah, it can be really challenging if those two things don't align. I think I would look further than the top interest. So just going back to that screen that I showed you earlier, I think you get a list of like kind of 50 interests or something like that. So you can start to dig a little bit deeper and identify something that does align with your brand values and your organizational view. But yeah, I wouldn't do something that's going to cause you, you know, longer term problems or create a disconnect between your brand and your audience. I don't know how often that would happen, that you would have such a massive kind of gap between your audience and what you do, but it could happen. So yeah, I think I would look a bit deeper on that list, maybe beyond the top 10 and see if there's something else in there, and start to play around with those issues and see if you get a positive response to them. But again, it's about testing what works. Just because it's the #1 interest on that Facebook Insights page doesn't necessarily mean that it would work every time for you. So again, you might need to play around with it a little bit. But yeah, I wouldn't do something just because it's on there if it is completely disconnected to what your business is all about, or conflicts with your values and ethics in any way, because that's just going to do you more harm longer term.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but it could be if, you know, the #1 interest is something which is quite unhealthy, and then your organisation is all around promoting healthy lifestyles, then obviously you can't be seen to be posting content which would be against the whole mission of the organisation. But yeah, that makes sense. Move further down. It's not just, you don't just have 1 or 2 or 3 interests, as you said. There is a lot more on there. So probably find something.
And it's how you frame those issues as well. So for example, the pizza topping poll that I showed you, if you're NHS England or an NHS trust, you might not want to put that out because it's, you know, it's not necessarily the healthiest thing. But if pizza comes up as one of the top interests, you could share a healthy recipe for making your own pizzas, or, you know, you can frame it in the way that supports your brand values and your organisation. So it's just being creative again and thinking about how you can use that issue to your advantage to engage with your audience, and it's still in a way that still supports what your organisation is all about.
Yeah, great point. So then there's just one more question, Dawn, and it's a big one. What was the result of the pizza poll?
Oh, well, to my dismay, more people liked pineapple than not, which I couldn't believe.
They did.
I don't do it. Sweet stuff on pizzas just don't work for me. But yeah, most people said yes.
Well, yeah, it's quite polarizing. It's a bit like Marmite. I think people either they just love it or they hate it. Like personally, I do quite like it. It's not my favourite. I wouldn't go for it every time, but I've got nothing against it, if I'm honest. So there we go.
I won't hold that against you
then. Thanks, Dawn. So I think that's a wrap. So I mean, I just want to say like massive thank you, Dawn, for joining us today and sharing those insights and stories. Really interesting. That was great to have you on. The session has been recorded, so anyone who's on the line today, if you want to sort of share it with your colleagues or watch it back again, you can do. That will be sent out to you at some point very soon after the webinar. And I think just make sure you have a good rest of your day and rest of the week, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.